The alien world of Valerian was a serene place, floating in the far reaches of a galaxy where light itself seemed softer, and the stars shone in patterns unfamiliar to most civilizations. Its people, the Valerians, had lived for centuries in peace. Their cities glimmered with luminescent towers that rose like delicate crystal spires, reflecting the soft light of their twin suns. Technology on Valerian was advanced, yet it was peaceful in nature. They built for comfort, knowledge, and harmony with the natural beauty of their world. They had no armies, no fleets prepared for war, and no experience in the kind of violence that other species in the galaxy had come to know all too well. For generations, the Valerians had believed that their isolation protected them. Nestled in a remote star cluster far from major trade routes, they thought their world was hidden, their civilization safe from the conflicts that often ravaged less fortunate planets. They had grown comfortable in this belief. Children learned the arts of science, philosophy, and creativity, not combat. Their daily lives revolved around exploration, education, and the pursuit of understanding the cosmos. The Valerians loved their world, and they loved each other, confident that their peaceful ways were enough to shield them from harm. Then, one day, everything changed. It began quietly, almost imperceptibly, with the first sightings, strange objects moving through space, appearing out of nowhere and vanishing just as quickly. At first, the Valerians thought it might be a natural phenomenon, a rare meteor shower, or a fluctuation in the gravity of a distant star. But the observations became more frequent, more deliberate, and their scientists, who were used to seeing the unusual in the skies, began to grow concerned. Satellites detected ships, massive and angular, unlike anything the Valerians had ever imagined. They carried a silent menace, moving with efficiency, precision, and purpose. The alarm was sounded quietly at first, through scientific channels, with theories proposed about interstellar traders or distant explorers. But soon the truth became impossible to ignore. The ships were not peaceful travelers. They carried weapons, structures meant to inflict destruction, and signals that hinted at aggression. The Valerians tried to communicate, reaching out across the void with their own transmissions, but the invaders ignored them entirely. As panic began to seep through the Valerian society, their leaders convened an emergency council. The Council of Elders, composed of the wisest and most respected members of the civilization, gathered in the grand hall of luminous harmony. The hall itself was a marvel, with walls that shimmered in ever-changing colors, reflecting not just light but emotion. The elders debated in hushed, urgent tones. They had never faced a threat like this. They had no armies, no defense systems capable of repelling an interstellar assault. Their knowledge of war was theoretical at best, a distant idea found in history books about other worlds. "We are vulnerable," one elder said, her voice trembling. "We have no protection against such force. We cannot fight them. Our technology is not designed for destruction. We are defenseless." Another elder, older and with eyes that had seen centuries of Valerian history, shook his head gravely. "We have lived in peace for so long that we forgot the world outside our stars is not always peaceful. We must act, or our civilization will end." A young scientist, barely recognized by the elders for her brilliance, spoke up. Her voice was calm but urgent. "There is only one option left. We must call for help. Somewhere out there, someone must be able to protect us. If we stay silent, we will be destroyed. If we reach out, perhaps there is hope." Hope, the word felt fragile in the vast emptiness of space. To the Valerians, it was almost an unfamiliar concept, because for so long, their world had been untouched, unthreatened. But now, hope was all they had left. The council agreed, knowing that it was the only path forward. They began preparing a distress transmission, a message sent across the galaxy that carried not just coordinates but the essence of their situation: fear, desperation, and the desperate plea of an entire species fighting for survival. The transmission was not simple. The Valerians had to encode it in a way that could be understood by multiple species, some of whom might have completely different perceptions of communication. It was a message crafted with care, ensuring that any listener would understand the severity of the situation. "We are under attack," it began, in the universal language of mathematical and physical patterns recognizable across civilizations. "Our world is defenseless. Our people are at risk. We ask for assistance. Any help, from any who can, is needed immediately." As the message was broadcast, fear spread through the cities. Families gathered in their homes, holding their young close. Children, too young to fully understand the concept of war, sensed the tension, the unease. Even the animals of Valerian, creatures attuned to emotion in ways humans could not comprehend, became restless, sensing the danger looming over their once safe world. The sky above Valerian, once a symbol of serenity, now seemed ominous. Shadows moved across the twin suns. Clouds of smoke and fire from preliminary strikes marred the beauty of the atmosphere. The Valerians could see their homes being threatened, but they were powerless to stop it. They could only wait and hope that someone, anyone, would hear their plea. Days passed, each one stretching longer than the last. The Valerians watched the skies constantly, scanning for signs of response. Every blip, every distant light, set hearts racing, but nothing came. Desperation began to take root. Scientists and leaders worked tirelessly, attempting to devise ways to strengthen defenses, but their knowledge was limited. Their efforts, though noble, were like planting seeds in a storm, futile against the scale of the threat. Yet the Valerians did not give up. They documented everything, hoping that even if they fell, their history would survive. Records were sent into orbiting satellites, deep into the oceans, and into the minds of their scholars. They hoped that someone, somewhere, would find these records and understand what had happened, and perhaps learn from their mistakes. It was in this fragile, tense state that the first distant signs of response appeared. Not a fleet, not a signal, but subtle fluctuations in space, a ripple that indicated someone, somewhere, had noticed their transmission. The Valerians dared not hope too much, but it was the first glimmer of possibility. Could it be that they were not alone in the galaxy? Could help actually come? The council met once more, acknowledging the uncertainty, but feeling a cautious optimism. If help comes, it may be unlike anything we expect, one elder said. We cannot assume their intentions or methods will resemble our own. We can only pray that they will save us. As the stars continued to shine over Valerian, there was a sense of suspense that hung over every city, every family, every individual. The world waited, on the edge of fear and hope. The alien civilization that had lived in peace for centuries now faced the harsh reality of survival, relying on strangers from across the galaxy to answer a call that could mean life or death. And somewhere, in the vast reaches of space, that call had begun to echo. Far beyond the star cluster that sheltered Valerian in the darker and more dangerous corners of the galaxy, the Deathworlders resided. Unlike the peaceful Valerians, the Deathworlders had evolved in a universe that demanded strength, cunning, and survival above all else. Their homeworld, Drakthar, was a planet of extremes, volcanoes that belched molten fire, oceans of corrosive acid, storms that could tear through cities in hours. Life there was harsh, unrelenting, and only the strongest could survive. From this unforgiving world, the Deathworlders emerged as warriors unmatched in any corner of space. They were feared, not for cruelty, but for their absolute efficiency and relentless capability in conflict. When the Valerians' SOS reached the Deathworlders, it did not stir compassion in the way a human might imagine. The Deathworlders did not think in terms of morality or kindness. They evaluated the message for opportunity, challenge, and duty. In their eyes, a civilization in danger presented a test, a puzzle of survival and strategy that demanded a response. Their fleets were always ready, ships designed not just for travel but for overwhelming force. They did not question whether to help. They questioned how swiftly and decisively they could act. The transmission from Valerian had traveled across light years, a pulse of desperation cutting through the void. On Drakthar, in the command chambers of their grand fleet, officers of the Deathworlders analyzed the signal. Their perception of the universe was starkly different from the Valerians. For them, life was defined by struggle, by dominance, and by the ability to face overwhelming threats without hesitation. Yet even they recognized the rarity of this essence. Few civilizations dared call for aid openly. Most either surrendered to threats or attempted feeble resistance. Valerian's plea was clear, precise, and desperate. It demanded attention. Immediately. Orders were given. Massive warships began mobilizing from orbit. These were not ordinary vessels. Each one was a fortress of weaponry, shields, and engines capable of faster-than-light travel. They were designed to operate in the harshest conditions of space, to endure bombardments that would obliterate ordinary fleets, and to deliver retaliation with precision unmatched in the galaxy. Crews of seasoned warriors took their stations. These were individuals who had trained in combat from birth, conditioned to remain calm even in the most chaotic engagements. The Valerians, unaware of the scale of what was coming, could only continue to hope. On their world, scientists monitored the skies, detecting unusual energy fluctuations in distant sectors. The first blips were almost imperceptible, faint pulses that did not match the Marauders' technology. At first they were dismissed as natural phenomena, but as minutes and hours passed, the signals grew stronger, more deliberate, more rhythmic. Something or someone was coming toward them. The journey of the Deathworlder fleet through space was unlike anything the Valerians could have imagined. Their ships moved with purpose and coordination, a dance of immense power. Energy shields shimmered along their hulls, reflecting starlight in eerie, unnatural patterns. Weapons arrays hummed softly, ready to unleash devastation, yet controlled with careful discipline. Every captain, every crew member, knew their role with precision. There was no hesitation. Even the vast distances of light years seemed like nothing to these masters of war. As the fleet approached, the first visible signs appeared. From Valerian's orbit, scientists and civilians alike observed streaks of light cutting across the void, ships larger than any natural asteroid, moving with terrifying speed and purpose. The Valerians could barely comprehend the scale. Some of their sensors could not even fully capture the dimensions of the vessels, as they dwarfed anything their civilization had ever created. Entire fleets of marauders, once confident in their superiority, would soon be confronted by forces beyond imagination. The people of Valerian began to gather in observation centers, standing silently and staring upward. Fear mixed with curiosity and awe. There was no sound, only the faint vibration of their instruments and the distant pulsing of energy signatures that grew ever stronger. Families held their young close. The Valerians, who had lived their lives without experience of war, now felt the enormity of the galaxy's dangers pressing down upon them. And yet, amid this fear, there was a faint glimmer of hope that help was finally on its way. The Deathworlders' approach was not subtle. Their ships did not sneak into orbit. They announced their arrival with deliberate displays of power. As they moved closer, the Valerians saw engines blazing with intense energy, casting stark light across the planet's surface. The largest ships could have swallowed cities whole, their silhouettes massive against the backdrop of twin suns. Yet, despite the threatening appearance, there was no indiscriminate attack. The Deathworlders were not here for conquest or plunder. They were here because the call demanded action, and they answered as they always did, swiftly, decisively, and with overwhelming force on board the lead ship. The commander of the fleet surveyed the approaching Valerian system. His eyes, adapted to see beyond the normal spectrum of light, studied every detail of the planetary shields, the energy signatures of the marauder ships, the vulnerable points in orbital defenses. Every movement, every reading, was catalogued and analyzed in seconds. Orders were given with crisp precision, and the fleet responded instantly. Every vessel knew its path, every weapon system was primed, and every warrior was ready. The Valerians, through their limited sensors, could detect the fleet now in orbit. Panic surged. Yet there was also an unmistakable sense of awe. They had never seen beings like this, never imagined that such forces existed. Their histories contained myths of ancient, powerful civilizations, but nothing in their knowledge came close to this reality. Even the most imaginative scientists could not fully comprehend the technology, the scale, or the purpose of the Deathworlder ships. Yet the Valerians did not fully understand what they were witnessing. To them, these ships were terrifying, almost monstrous in their appearance. The light reflected from their hulls made the surface of the planet seem dim by comparison. From the ground, they could see shadows cast over cities, clouds of energy that shimmered unnaturally. And still, amid this overwhelming display, there was no sign of violence directed at their world. The Deathworlders were not attacking. They were preparing. In the command centers of Valerian, council members watched in stunned silence. Communications officers attempted to reach the fleet, sending messages of gratitude and warning, unsure whether the Deathworlders even recognized them. It did not matter. The fleet acted with independent awareness, moving as one organism with a single purpose. To the Valerians it seemed almost mystical. How could a force so vast and destructive operate with such coordinated efficiency? For hours, the fleet continued its advance. It was both terrifying and mesmerizing. The Valerians could see energy shields forming around the largest ships, preparing for possible attack. Weapon systems extended along the hulls, bristling in anticipation. The smaller escort ships moved in tight formations, ready to strike with precision. The sheer scale of the armada was overwhelming. It was unlike anything the Valerians had ever encountered, yet it inspired a cautious hope. Perhaps, finally, the nightmare that had descended upon their world would be countered as the fleet closed in. The Valerians began to speculate about the beings aboard. Who were they? What did they want? Could they be trusted? The myths of the galaxy's dangerous species flashed through their minds. There were stories of merciless warriors who answered calls for help but demanded payment or submission in return. But as they watched the methodical, unwavering advance of the Deathworlders, they realized these beings were something else entirely. Their actions did not suggest greed or conquest. They suggested purpose, discipline, and an unyielding sense of duty. Finally, the first direct signals were detected. Energy pulses communicated a simple message. They were aware of the distress call, and help had arrived. It was not polite, it was not diplomatic, it was direct, functional, and commanding. The Valerians' relief was immediate, almost overwhelming. They had called for help, and the help they received was unlike anything they could have imagined. It was raw, it was powerful, and it would change their understanding of the universe forever. As night fell over Valerian, the twin suns dipping below the horizon, the shadow of the Deathworlder fleet stretched across the planet. Cities were bathed in strange alien light. Citizens looked skyward in awe, unable to comprehend the magnitude of what was happening. The peaceful civilization had, for the first time, witnessed the arrival of true power, an unstoppable force that could confront the threats which had once seemed insurmountable. The Valerians knew. The next hours would determine their fate. The Marauders were still in orbit, still threatening destruction, still confident in their dominance. But the arrival of the Deathworlders had shifted the balance. The first stage was complete. The Valerians' call had been answered. What would follow was a confrontation the likes of which their world had never seen, and their civilization would never be the same. For the Valerians, fear remained, but it was now mixed with hope and awe. They had glimpsed beings who could change the course of events, whose strengths dwarfed anything in their understanding of the galaxy. The world of Valerian waited, holding its breath, as the Deathworlders prepared to enter the battle. The peaceful alien civilization, once on the brink of destruction, now had a chance at survival because the most fearsome warriors in the galaxy had arrived. The Valerians watched in awe as the Deathworlder fleet moved into position above their planet. From every city, every observation tower, every glass-enclosed hall that dotted their luminescent cities, people stared upward, their eyes wide with a mixture of fear and amazement. Never in the history of Valerian had a sight like this been witnessed. The ships were colossal, far larger than the Marauders' fleets they had feared for days. Each vessel seemed alive, almost breathing with energy. Pulses of light ran along their hulls like veins, and shimmering shields created an ever-changing kaleidoscope of colors against the dark backdrop of space that the Valerians' scientists tried to analyze what they were seeing. But even their advanced instruments could barely comprehend the scale and power of the fleet. Every reading was off the charts. The ship's weapon systems were unlike anything documented in Valerian history. Shields could withstand energy outputs millions of times stronger than anything the Valerians had ever constructed. And yet, despite the potential for destruction, the fleet remained poised, patient, and methodical. It was not chaos, it was control. Precise, deliberate control that the Valerians had never encountered. In the Grand Hall of Luminous Harmony, the Council of Elders gathered again. They had spent the previous days attempting to maintain order, comforting citizens, and coordinating what little defenses they had. Now, as the Deathworlders approached, the council faced a mixture of emotions: fear, relief, awe, and curiosity. "The fleet is immense," said one elder, her voice trembling slightly. "I have studied battles, read the histories of other civilizations, and observed conflicts from other worlds. But this is beyond anything I have ever imagined. Their power, it is absolute." Another elder, older and more stoic, replied, "Power alone does not tell us their intentions. We cannot assume they will help simply because they have arrived. They may judge us, test us, or even punish us. We know nothing of their ways." A young scientist, her hands shaking as she manipulated her console, added, "I have analyzed their energy signatures. They are not attacking, yet every measure of their ships indicates readiness for war. It is as though they anticipate conflict, but we do not yet know their target. Perhaps the Marauders are not their concern, or perhaps they have calculated the entire engagement in advance. Either way, we must prepare for anything." Outside the hall, citizens of Valerian continued to gather, some speaking in hushed tones, others whispering prayers or expressing disbelief. Families huddled together, children clinging to their parents, trying to make sense of the enormous alien shapes that now dominated their skies. For many, the experience was overwhelming, bordering on the spiritual. The sight of the Deathworlder fleet invoked emotions that were hard to describe: fear of what could happen, but also an instinctive recognition that these beings could ensure their survival. The Valerians had always believed in the safety of isolation. Their world had been untouched by war or invasion for centuries. But now, in the presence of the Deathworlders, that belief had been shattered. They understood, perhaps for the first time, that the universe was vast, complex, and often unforgiving. They had been naive to think that no threat could ever reach their skies. And yet, even in this moment of stark realization, hope began to grow. As the fleet continued its advance, Valerian scientists noticed patterns in the movement of the ships. They were not simply drifting through space. Each ship followed a precise path, maintaining formations that were both defensive and intimidating. The fleet moved as if it were a single organism, every vessel anticipating the needs and movements of the others. Even the smallest escort ships, designed for reconnaissance and precision strikes, maintained perfect alignment with the largest battleships. The Valerians were fascinated and terrified. They had never seen such discipline or coordination. The Marauders, observing from their own orbit, began to realize the magnitude of what was arriving. They had believed their superiority would allow them to control the system with ease. Yet these new arrivals dwarfed their forces in both scale and power. Panic spread among their ranks, and yet they could not comprehend fully the nature of the beings now watching them. The Valerians, witnessing this interaction, felt a strange sense of validation. For the first time, they were not completely powerless observers. They saw their attackers faltering in the presence of a force beyond imagination. The Valerians also began to recognize something about the Death demeanor. These beings did not seem cruel, at least not in the way the Valerians understood cruelty. There was no unnecessary aggression directed at their world. Instead, the fleet projected authority, control, and readiness. It was as if the Deathworlders evaluated the entire situation and calculated the consequences of every action before taking a single step. It was a discipline the Valerians had never known, unyielding, an absolute. In the cities below, children who had grown up playing games of strategy and imagination now found themselves witnessing real-life tactics on a scale they could never have conceived. Schools paused, lectures were interrupted, and families gathered on terraces and observation platforms. The sheer size of the fleet made the streets feel smaller. The cities seemed fragile, and the Valerians' vulnerability tangible. Yet paradoxically, it also made them feel safer. There was a silent understanding that these beings were here because they could change the outcome. because their power was sufficient to confront the marauders that had terrorized their world as hours passed. The Valerians became acutely aware of the psychological impact of the Deathworlders' presence. Fear had not disappeared, but it had evolved into a cautious awe. The people who had once been paralyzed by the marauders' attacks now observed a force that could protect them, that could challenge their attackers in ways they could not even imagine. The sky was no longer just a threat, had become a source of hope, and yet that hope was tinged with uncertainty. The Deathworlders were not friendly. They were not necessarily allies in the way the Valerians understood alliances. They were powerful, disciplined, and unpredictable. In the command centers of Valerian, officials attempted communication again. Messages were sent, carefully crafted and repeated, expressing gratitude and requesting guidance. They did not expect a response in words. The Deathworlders did not operate in ordinary diplomacy, but they hoped that the aliens would understand their intentions. Each signal sent was a mix of relief and fear. Relief that someone had arrived, fear that they could not fully understand the beings before them. The scientists also began to speculate about the Deathworlders' technology. How could a fleet so enormous move with such precision? How could energy shields withstand the force of thousands of possible attacks? How could each vessel operate independently yet coordinate perfectly with the rest? The questions were endless, and yet every hypothesis led to a single conclusion. These were not beings who relied on chance. They relied on mastery of technology, mastery of strategy, and mastery of war. Meanwhile, the Valerians' leaders attempted to prepare their people psychologically for what was to come. Although they had called for help, they had no guarantee of how the Deathworlders would act. They might engage the marauders with devastating force, or they might test the Valerians in ways they could not predict. Families were urged to remain calm. Children were encouraged to stay inside safe structures, and citizens were reminded to trust in the calculations of their scientists. The atmosphere was tense, but there was a growing sense of anticipation, a feeling that the arrival of the Deathworlders was the turning point that could save their civilization. Throughout the day and into the first night, the Valerians continued to watch. From the ground, the enormous ships seemed almost alive, their movements purposeful, deliberate, and terrifying. Shadows stretched across the planet, and the twin suns cast eerie reflections on the surfaces of the alien vessels. Energy pulses, visible even from the surface, created a subtle hum in the atmosphere, of vibration that resonated through every city, reminding the Valerians that their world was no longer isolated, no longer alone. The Valerians' fear slowly shifted into a complex mixture of awe, gratitude, and apprehension. They had long lived in a world where survival was certain, where threats were distant and theoretical. Now they faced reality. The universe was vast, dangerous, and unforgiving, yet they had also seen the possibility of salvation, brought not by diplomacy or negotiation, but by raw power and absolute control. It was a lesson in the harsh truths of the galaxy. Strength commands respect, and intervention can arrive from places unimaginable. By the time the Deathworlder fleet had fully arrived in orbit, the Valerians had adjusted to its presence. The initial shock of awe had passed, replaced by a tense expectation. The stage was set for what would come next. The confrontation between the marauders and the Deathworlders, a battle that would determine the fate of Valerian. For the first time in their history, the Valerians understood that survival was not about isolation, but about recognizing the forces at play in the universe, and sometimes about relying on powers far beyond their comprehension. The people of Valerian waited, their emotions a complex mixture of fear, hope, and admiration. They had called for help, and the help had arrived, but it was unlike anything they had imagined. The Deathworlders were not gentle saviors. They were masters of war, disciplined and relentless. And yet, somehow, their arrival brought the possibility of survival, a chance that Valerian might endure, that their civilization might continue despite the unprecedented threat that had descended upon their world. And so, the alien civilization watched the vast, terrifying, and awe-inspiring fleet, knowing that the next phase of their story was about to unfold. The stage was set, and the galaxy itself seemed to hold its breath as the Deathworlders prepared to confront the marauders and determine the fate of Valerian. The calm, tense anticipation that had gripped Valerian shattered when the first engagement began. From orbit, the Valerians could see the marauders' ships moving hastily, their formations breaking under the overwhelming presence of the Deathworlder fleet. The marauders had been confident, believing that their superior numbers and previous successes would intimidate any potential defender. But they had miscalculated. They had underestimated not only the power arriving to confront them, but also the precision and ruthlessness of the Deathworlders. It began with the smallest maneuvers, almost imperceptible at first. Ships of the Deathworlder fleet shifted positions, aligning themselves into combat formations that seemed both natural and terrifying. Their weapons arrays extended outward in perfect symmetry, energy pulses ready to strike at a moment's notice. To the Valerians it appeared almost like a predator circling its prey, every move calculated, every action precise, every intention clear, even without communication. The marauders attempted to respond. They fired volleys of energy beams, missiles, and projectiles, aiming to overwhelm the Deathworlders by sheer force. But the fleet's shields absorbed the attacks with ease. Every strike that should have caused damage was reflected or dispersed, leaving the Valerians' scientists astonished. Not a single Deathworlder ship was harmed, not a single formation broken. The Marauders' confidence began to falter, replaced with confusion and fear. They had never encountered an opponent like this, an enemy that did not panic, did not hesitate, and could neutralize their attacks effortlessly. Then came the counterstrike. The Deathworlders did not merely defend themselves. They attacked with the precision of a surgeon and the power of a storm. Energy beams lashed out, slicing through the Marauders' ships with surgical accuracy. Missiles, guided by advanced targeting systems, found weak points in the hulls and exploded in controlled detonations. Entire groups of Marauder ships were vaporized before they could respond. The Valerians watched in awe and terror. The sky above their planet, once a place of beauty, became a theater of overwhelming force. Explosions flashed against the blackness of space, light reflecting in eerie patterns over Valerian's surface. The Deathworlders moved as a single organism. Each ship knew the position of every other, anticipating the enemy's actions before they occurred. The Marauders, despite their experience and confidence, could not adapt quickly enough. Every attempt to regroup, every maneuver designed to outflank the Deathworlders was anticipated and countered. To the Valerians it seemed almost like magic, but they understood, even without full comprehension, that it was skill, discipline, and relentless efficiency. As the battle unfolded, the Valerians noticed something remarkable. Despite the sheer destruction raining down on the Marauders, the Deathworlders did not attack indiscriminately. They targeted the ships that posed the most immediate threat, neutralizing danger without unnecessary collateral damage. From the planet's surface, the people could see flashes of destruction, yet there was a method, a calculation behind every strike. The Deathworlders were not just warriors, they were strategists, enforcers of order in the chaos of war. For the Valerians, who had never seen conflict on such a scale, it was both terrifying and inspiring. Families watched together, their children clinging to them, yet unable to look away. Scholars and scientists recorded every moment, documenting the tactics, the precision, and the sheer power of the fleet. The realization began to sink in. Their civilization, once on the brink of annihilation, was now being protected by forces that could overcome almost any threat in the galaxy. The Marauders, in desperation, attempted more aggressive tactics. They tried to coordinate attacks, to create diversions, to overwhelm individual Deathworlder ships. But every maneuver failed. The fleet's response was instantaneous, adapting to every change, closing off escape routes, and striking with calculated force. Ships that had once dominated systems with ease were now obliterated in seconds, leaving nothing behind but fragments drifting through space. Panic spread among the enemy ranks, and their formation broke entirely. The Valerians could hardly comprehend the scale of destruction. Thousands of Marauder ships were destroyed, yet the Deathworlders' fleet remained virtually untouched. Their movements were precise, efficient, and ruthless. It was clear to the Valerians that these beings were not driven by emotion, they were driven by purpose. And that purpose was simple: eliminate the threat and restore balance, no matter the difficulty. From the surface of Valerian, the sight was almost surreal. Bright streaks of light cut across space as energy beams lanced outward. Ships exploded in silent bursts of fire and debris, and the once ominous shadow of the Marauder fleet began to diminish rapidly. The twin suns reflected off the hulls of the Deathworlders' ships, creating patterns of light that seemed almost hypnotic. People could feel the vibration of energy pulses in the atmosphere, a subtle hum that reminded them of the immense power now defending their world. Amid the chaos, the Valerians' leaders tried to maintain calm among their people. They issued instructions to avoid open areas, to stay indoors, and to keep communication lines open. But for many, staying calm was nearly impossible. The sky, once a symbol of peace and beauty, had become a battleground. Yet, through fear and tension, hope persisted. The people could see that the forces attacking their world were being overwhelmed, that the Deathworlders were not only capable of protecting them but were doing so with unmatched efficiency. In the command centers of Valerian, scientists attempted to analyze every strike. Every maneuver of the Deathworlders was recorded, every pattern studied. The Valerians realized that this battle was not just about defense, it was a demonstration of absolute mastery. The Deathworlders anticipated threats, neutralized them before they could escalate, and maintained control over the entire conflict. Even in the midst of destruction, there was a sense of order, a system within the chaos. The Marauders, realizing that defeat was inevitable, attempted a final desperate measure. They tried to retreat, to regroup in safer positions, and perhaps to strike from unexpected angles. But the Deathworlders had already calculated every possible contingency. Escape routes were blocked, strategic positions neutralized, and enemy ships destroyed with relentless precision. Within hours, the Marauders' fleet was decimated. From the Valerians' perspective, what had seemed like insurmountable danger had vanished almost entirely, leaving only scattered remnants drifting helplessly through space. For the Valerians, the realization was profound. Their world had been saved, not through negotiation, not through diplomacy, but through sheer force, precision, and strategic genius. The Deathworlders had not merely intervened, they had annihilated the threat with efficiency that the Valerians could barely comprehend. In this moment they understood the true scale of the forces in the galaxy. There were beings capable of overwhelming power, beings whose skill and discipline could alter the fate of entire civilizations in hours. As the battle concluded, the Valerians noticed the silence that followed. The sky, once filled with flashes of energy and explosions, became still again. Debris floated harmlessly, no longer a threat. The Deathworlders maintained their positions, vigilant, scanning for any remaining dangers. They did not celebrate, they did not gloat, they simply prepared, ready for any additional threats that might arise. Their presence was a statement in itself. They were protectors in the most direct sense, and their methods left no room for doubt about their capabilities. The Valerians emerged cautiously from their shelters, eyes wide, hearts pounding, and minds struggling to process what they had witnessed. Their civilization had been moments away from destruction, yet it had been spared by beings they barely understood, mixed with lingering fear, as the people realized that while the Deathworlders had saved them, the galaxy was vast, dangerous, and filled with forces beyond comprehension. Their survival was not guaranteed. It had been secured only through the intervention of a power that was almost incomprehensible in scale and discipline. Families embraced, children laughed nervously, and scholars whispered to one another, trying to analyze every detail. The city streets slowly filled again, as people ventured out to witness the aftermath of the battle. The sight of destroyed marauder ships drifting harmlessly in space was surreal. The Valerians could see that their homeworld had been spared, not by chance, not by luck, but by beings whose mastery of war was absolute. And yet, as relief settled over the planet, a deeper understanding began to emerge. The Deathworlders were not ordinary allies. They were not motivated by morality or empathy. They acted because the call demanded it, because their purpose was to restore balance and eliminate threats with precision. The Valerians had survived, but their survival had been orchestrated by beings whose methods were unfamiliar, whose intentions were defined by a code far beyond Valerian comprehension. The alien civilization of Valerian, once naive in its belief in isolation and peace, had now witnessed the raw reality of the galaxy. They had seen that help could arrive from places unimaginable, that survival required forces capable of overwhelming power, and that even the most terrifying beings could serve as protectors when purpose aligned with necessity. As night fell over Valerian, the twin suns dipping below the horizon, the planet seemed both small and fragile beneath the silent, the watchful presence of the Deathworlder fleet. The people understood that their world had been changed forever. The marauders were defeated, their threat neutralized, but the memory of the battle and the presence of the Deathworlders would remain with them for generations. Their civilization had survived, but it had been a lesson in the scale, discipline, and ruthlessness that existed in the universe beyond their once peaceful skies. And so, the Valerians began to rebuild, to reflect, and to contemplate the immense forces that had intervened to save them. Their world was safe, but their understanding of the galaxy, of danger, and of power had been forever transformed. The battle was over, yet the echoes of its power lingered in the minds of the Valerians. From their vantage points across the cities of Valerian, they could still see the remnants of the marauder fleet drifting in orbit, shattered hulls, fragmented ships, and energy cores still faintly pulsing as they floated silently in the void. The sheer scale of destruction was unlike anything the Valerians had ever imagined. What had once seemed like an insurmountable threat had been completely neutralized, not by luck, not by chance, but by the calculated, overwhelming force of the Deathworlders for the citizens. The relief was profound, but it was intertwined with awe and a lingering fear. The Deathworlders had not attacked their world indiscriminately, yet their presence had dominated the skies. Their ships were massive, bristling with weaponry, and exuded power that was almost overwhelming. Families who had spent hours in shelters during the battle now emerged cautiously to observe the aftermath. Children clung to their parents, whispering questions they did not fully understand. Who were these beings? Why had they saved them? Were they still dangerous? The elders convened once more, this time not to plan survival, but to assess the impact of what had occurred. The council members were exhausted, their minds racing as they tried to comprehend the implications of the battle. This was not merely defense, one elder said, his voice heavy with the weight of understanding. This was a demonstration of absolute power. We are fortunate to have survived, but we have witnessed a force far beyond our comprehension. Another elder, quieter and more contemplative, added, and yet, we must learn from what we have seen. These beings operate on a code and a discipline unlike anything in our history. Their power is terrifying, but so is their method. They did not destroy indiscriminately. They removed the threat with precision and efficiency. That is a lesson we must remember. The young scientist who had first suggested sending the SOS now stood among the council, reflecting on what had transpired. We have been given a chance to continue, she said softly. But survival will require more than gratitude. We must understand the universe we live in. It is not enough to be peaceful. We must recognize the forces at play and respect them. Meanwhile, Across the planet, the Valerians began to process the psychological impact of what had occurred. Citizens who had never experienced fear on such a scale now understood the fragility of their civilization. The twin suns that had always symbolized warmth and stability now cast long shadows across cities that had almost been lost. Yet, despite this newfound awareness, there was also a sense of hope. Their civilization had survived against overwhelming odds, and it had been saved by beings who, for all their terrifying power, that had acted with purpose and restraint. In the aftermath of the battle, the Valerians, scientists and engineers worked tirelessly to analyze what had happened. They studied every movement of the Deathworlder fleet, every strike against the Marauders, every defensive maneuver. They tried to understand the technology, the tactics, and the coordination that had allowed the Deathworlders to succeed where no other force could have. For them, it was an education in power, discipline, and strategy on a scale previously unimaginable. Yet, alongside admiration, there was a sobering realization. The Deathworlders were not gentle allies. They did not operate according to Valerian morality or ethics. Their methods were precise, their judgment absolute, and their intervention dictated by purpose, not empathy. The Valerians had survived because their call had been heard, but they were acutely aware that survival in the galaxy depended on recognizing forces beyond their comprehension and learning how to navigate them wisely. Some citizens attempted to communicate directly with the Death, sending messages of gratitude and offering assistance. There was little expectation of a response, yet there was hope that their presence might be acknowledged. The Deathworlders did not reply in conventional language. Their communication was subtle, through energy pulses, movement patterns, and the deliberate positioning of ships. It was a language of power and intent, one that the Valerians could barely interpret, yet its meaning was unmistakable. The threat was eliminated, and the planet was now safe. As the days passed, Valerian began to recover. Repairs to damaged satellites, minor orbital defenses, and infrastructure began immediately. Citizens returned to work, schools reopened, and the flow of daily life slowly resumed. Yet the memory of the battle, and the presence of the Deathworlder fleet, lingered. Children who had witnessed the events told stories to one another, describing the enormous ships, the energy beams, and the overwhelming sense of power that had protected them. The adults spoke in quieter tones, reflecting on the lessons learned, the fragility of their civilization, and the extraordinary intervention that had saved them. The Marauders, once confident in their dominance, were completely neutralized. The surviving fragments of their fleet drifted harmlessly in orbit, incapable of regrouping or posing further threat. The Valerians watched cautiously, understanding that although the immediate danger had passed, the universe remained unpredictable. They had been spared, but only because the Deathworlders had intervened. Their survival was not guaranteed by luck. It was granted by beings whose skill, discipline, and judgment were beyond their understanding. As time went on, the Valerians began to reflect on the larger implications. Their civilization had been isolated, naive in its belief that peace alone could protect them. The events of the past days revealed the harsh reality of the galaxy. Power, strategy, and the ability to respond to threats were essential. The Valerians understood that they must grow stronger, not necessarily through war, but through awareness, preparation, and understanding of the forces that governed the universe. The elders began to organize educational programs, teaching citizens about the events they had witnessed and the lessons to be learned. They emphasized that survival required knowledge of the universe, respect for powerful forces, and readiness for unexpected challenges. Children learned not just history and science, but also strategy, observation, and critical thinking. The young scientist became a prominent figure in these efforts, helping to translate observations of the Deathworlders' tactics into lessons the Valerians could understand. Despite the fear and awe, there was also a profound sense of gratitude. The Valerians had survived what seemed impossible. Their civilization, which had been moments away from annihilation, was intact. Their homeworld, their families, and their culture had been preserved. The Deathworlders had demonstrated that even in a universe filled with dangers, intervention could come from the most unlikely sources. Yet, this gratitude was mixed with humility. The Valerians realized that survival was never guaranteed, that the galaxy was vast and unpredictable, and that reliance on others, even powerful allies, came with its own lessons and responsibilities. In private moments, citizens reflected on the paradoxical nature of their saviors. The Deathworlders were terrifying, immensely powerful, and capable of destruction beyond comprehension. And yet, they had chosen to protect Valerian. Their intervention was not motivated by morality, kindness, or friendship, but by purpose, discipline, and a recognition that the Valerians' call demanded a response. This realization left a lasting impression on the people. The universe did not operate according to their values. It operated according to forces far greater and often indifferent to their existence. The Valerians, scholars, and leaders also began to consider the implications for future encounters. If the Deathworlders had saved them once, could they do so again? Or would other civilizations, equally unaware of the dangers around them, face extinction without intervention? These questions sparked a new era of study and preparation. Valerian began to invest more in understanding interstellar communications, potential threats, and the technological capabilities required to survive in a galaxy that was far less forgiving than they had imagined across the planet. Ordinary citizens experienced a mixture of relief, awe, and renewed determination. Markets reopened, schools resumed classes, and life slowly returned to normal. Yet the memory of the battle and the Deathworlders' presence remained vivid. Children spoke of the enormous ships and the energy that had protected them, while adults discussed the importance of preparation and understanding the larger universe. The events had reshaped their culture, their education, and their worldview. Peace alone was no longer sufficient. Awareness, knowledge, and preparedness became equally important values, in quiet moments. The Valerians also reflected on the nature of power itself. The Deathworlders had not sought reward, recognition, or alliance. They had acted according to their own principles, their own understanding of balance and purpose. This was a civilization unlike any the Valerians had encountered, one that demonstrated that strength, when guided by discipline and strategy, could preserve life rather than destroy it. It was a paradox they would contemplate for generations. The most fearsome beings in the galaxy had become the guardians of their survival. As the aftermath continued, Valerian itself began to heal. Damaged satellites were repaired, minor orbital debris cleared, and cities restored to full functionality. The population, though still wary, began to regain a sense of security. And yet, beneath this sense of recovery lay a permanent transformation in perspective. The Valerians knew that the universe was far larger, more complex, and more dangerous than they had ever imagined. Their survival had depended not on their own strength, but on the intervention of forces capable of overwhelming power. The elders, in concluding councils, emphasized this lesson to all citizens. They spoke of vigilance, preparedness, and humility. They encouraged study, observation, and the pursuit of knowledge about the forces that governed the galaxy. The events of the past days would become central to their history, not just as a story of survival, but as a lesson in understanding the scale, discipline, and ruthlessness that existed beyond Valerian. And so, the alien civilization began a new chapter. The immediate threat had passed, the marauders defeated, and Valerian preserved, but the lessons were profound. Power could be terrifying yet protective. Survival required awareness, preparation, and respect for forces beyond comprehension. And help, when it came, might arrive in forms that were frightening, absolute, and awe-inspiring. The Valerians had witnessed the intervention of the Deathworlders, and their civilization would never view the universe in the same way again. Months had passed since the battle that had nearly destroyed Valerian, and the memory of the Deathworlders' arrival lingered like a shadow over the planet. Life had returned to a semblance of normalcy, but the experience had changed every aspect of Valerian society. Citizens moved through their cities with a newfound awareness, their routines tinged with the understanding that their civilization was fragile, that the universe beyond their skies was vast, unpredictable, and often dangerous. The memory of the marauders' threat and the overwhelming power that had saved them could not be erased, and it shaped the mindset of every individual, from the youngest child learning about the battle in school to the eldest elder reflecting on the fragility of peace. The Valerians had survived, but they knew survival alone was not enough. The lesson of the Deathworlders was clear. Power, strategy, and discipline were forces that could protect life, but also forces that demanded respect. Their civilization had been preserved not by chance, not by negotiation, but by beings whose skills and judgment exceeded anything they had ever known. The presence of the Deathworlders had introduced a new understanding of the universe, an understanding that survival depended not only on peaceful existence but also on awareness, preparation, and recognition of forces beyond comprehension. In the aftermath, the Council of Elders took extraordinary measures to ensure that the lessons of the battle were not forgotten. Schools incorporated studies of the events, teaching children about strategy, observation, and the importance of understanding both allies and potential threats. Universities established departments dedicated to interstellar studies, focusing on the technology, discipline, and tactics of civilizations like the Deathworlders. Scientists, inspired by what they had witnessed, began designing new defensive systems, studying energy shields, fleet coordination, and other advanced technologies with the hope that Valerian could be better prepared for the future. The social impact of the Deathworlders' arrival was also profound. Families shared stories of the day their world was saved, and the events became a common point of reference in conversations, art, and literature. Artists painted murals of the colossal ships, capturing the eerie beauty and terrifying power that had hovered above the planet. Writers composed stories blending fact and imagination, attempting to convey the awe, fear, and wonder that had gripped their civilization. Children, in their games, recreated the battle with vivid imagination, learning lessons about courage, strategy, and observation even as they played. Despite the return to routine, the Valerians remained vigilant. They established monitoring stations across the planet and in orbit, designed to detect any future threats quickly. They studied the remnants of the marauder fleet, analyzing debris and energy patterns, learning as much as possible about the tactics of their former attackers. They realized that the galaxy was filled with civilizations capable of both destruction and defense, and that understanding the balance of power was essential for survival. The Deathworlders had shown them the consequences of strength combined with discipline, and the Valerians took this lesson to heart. The presence of the Deathworlders, though brief, had a lasting psychological effect. Citizens who had experienced the battle firsthand often spoke of the overwhelming sense of awe they felt while observing the fleet. The ships were immense, bristling with weaponry, yet their movements were precise and coordinated. The energy shields, the calculated attacks, the way they neutralized the marauders with efficiency and restraint, all of it left an indelible impression. For the Valerians, these were not merely memories of war. They were lessons in understanding the scale of power in the universe and the discipline required to wield it effectively. The leaders of Valerian also understood that their civilization's survival depended on maintaining readiness for the unexpected. They developed strategic plans for potential future encounters, drawing on lessons learned from the Deathworlders' intervention. These plans included defensive protocols, evacuation strategies, and communication systems capable of reaching distant allies or advanced civilizations. While Valerian had been spared once, the elders knew that the universe was not static, and new threats could emerge at any time. Preparedness became a central principle of governance, alongside peace, diplomacy, and exploration. As time passed, rumors of the Deathworlders spread throughout Valerian and beyond. Scholars who had observed the battle wrote detailed analyses, documenting not only the events but the nature of the beings themselves. The Deathworlders became both legend and example, a symbol of ultimate discipline, strategy, and power. Across Valerian, people spoke of them with a mixture of respect, fear, and fascination. The children of the planet grew up knowing the story, internalizing its lessons, and aspiring to understand the universe as it truly was: vast, dangerous, and full of beings far stronger than themselves. The Valerians also reflected on the paradoxical nature of their saviors. The Deathworlders were terrifying, capable of immense destruction, yet they had acted as protectors. They did not intervene for friendship, moral obligation, or reward. They intervened because purpose and discipline dictated it. This understanding reshaped Valerian perspectives on morality and power. They learned that survival did not always follow their expectations of fairness or kindness, but depended on recognizing forces capable of enforcing outcomes, whether or not they aligned with the Valerians' values. Over the following months, Valerian society adapted in subtle ways. Citizens became more observant, more analytical, and more willing to question assumptions about the universe. Trade and exploration protocols were updated to include contingency plans for encountering unknown civilizations. The study of alien technology, tactics, and psychology became central to academic pursuits. Even culture and art reflected the new worldview, blending wonder and caution, beauty and the awareness of danger. The people of Valerian had been transformed, not only by survival but by knowledge, the knowledge that the universe was larger, more complex, and more unpredictable than they had ever imagined. The Deathworlders themselves did not linger. Once the threat was neutralized and their purpose completed, they departed as silently and efficiently as they had arrived. The Valerians observed the fleet leaving, aware that their protectors were gone but still present in memory and legend. Their departure left a mixture of relief and lingering awe. The skies were once again quiet, but the memory of power, discipline, and strategy remained etched into every mind. The Valerians had witnessed beings who could alter the fate of entire civilizations in hours, and that realization shaped their understanding of the universe permanently. Even after the fleet's departure, Valerian scholars continued to study the aftermath of the battle. They analyzed the remaining energy signatures, observed debris fields, and recorded patterns in the Deathworlders' approach and tactics. Every detail was documented, providing valuable insight into civilizations far more advanced and disciplined than their own. The Valerians recognized that knowledge and preparedness were as important as courage and hope. Their survival had been granted by beings capable of overwhelming power, but understanding that power was essential if they hoped to face future threats with confidence. The children who had witnessed the battle grew up with stories of courage, strategy, and discipline. They learned not only the technical aspects of the encounter but also the importance of observation, patience, and readiness. Games, education, and cultural storytelling incorporated lessons from the events, ensuring that the memory of the Deathworlders' intervention would guide future generations. The events became a cornerstone of Valerian identity, a reminder that survival required awareness, respect for power, and preparation for the unexpected. Leaders and scholars debated long-term strategies. They realized that Valerian could not rely solely on chance or hope for intervention from powerful civilizations. Plans were made to establish interstellar communications, reconnaissance systems, and defensive fleets. While Valerian might never match the Deathworlders' power, the lessons of strategy, discipline, and calculated response could guide their civilization in navigating a universe filled with danger. The battle had been a turning point, not only for survival but for the evolution of Valerian understanding and preparedness. Even as the years passed, the story of the Deathworlders remained vivid. Each anniversary of the battle was observed as a day of reflection, education, and remembrance. Families recounted experiences to younger generations. Scholars updated records with new analyses, and artists created new works capturing the awe-inspiring presence of the fleet. The events shaped Valerian culture, blending memory, caution, and inspiration. The people understood that survival had been granted by beings whose methods and power transcended their understanding, and that such knowledge was essential for guiding their future. The marauders were never able to recover. Their fleet, obliterated by precision strikes, could not regroup, and Valerian remained free from further immediate threats. Yet the Valerians understood that freedom was fragile, contingent on awareness, vigilance, and the lessons learned from the Deathworlders' intervention. Survival was no longer passive. It required thought, strategy, and the recognition that the universe was larger and more dangerous than they had imagined. In the end, Valerian had survived against overwhelming odds. Their civilization had endured, preserved by beings of unimaginable power and discipline. The Deathworlders had acted according to their purpose, without emotion, without reward, and without hesitation. The Valerians had witnessed their efficiency, their strategy, and their absolute mastery of war and coordination. From this, they learned a truth that would guide their society forever. In a galaxy filled with danger, knowledge, preparedness, and respect for power were as important as courage and hope. Valerian became a civilization transformed. Its citizens were wiser, more aware, and more respectful of the vast universe around them. Their culture, education, and governance evolved to reflect the lessons learned from the intervention. And although the Deathworlders were gone, their presence remained in memory, shaping the mindset of the Valerians, inspiring future generations, and serving as a permanent reminder that the universe was both beautiful and terrifying, full of forces that could destroy or protect in equal measure. The legacy of the Deathworlders endured as a story of awe, power, and survival. The Valerians had witnessed the might of beings far beyond their comprehension and had learned the importance of preparation, observation, and strategic thinking. They had survived, and in surviving, they had evolved not only in technology and defense, but in understanding the universe and their place within it. The galaxy was vast, dangerous, and unpredictable, but Valerian had endured, guided by the lessons of discipline, purpose, and the awe-inspiring presence of the Deathworlders. And so, the planet of Valerian flourished once more, forever changed, its people wiser and stronger in understanding. The stars above were no longer merely lights in the sky. They were reminders of the forces that could shape destiny, and the memory of the Deathworlders would guide Valerian for generations to come. Their intervention had not only saved a civilization, it had transformed it, ensuring that Valerian would face the future with knowledge, courage, and the wisdom gained from witnessing true power in action.